Hello. Today we're going to talk about social stratification and social inequality. Last week we talked about social deviance, so this is a departure from that. We're starting to talk about what sociologists call the big three. The big three being class, race, and gender. So this is your first kind of foray into these social structures which shape humans' lives. We've been talking about how human beings become human selves in a social context, and we've been talking about how human beings behave at the micro and meso level, meaning how they behave in small and medium groups. This is the beginning of talking about larger social structures and what we call social categories. We'll talk more about what a social category means in a little while, but keep that term in mind as we move forward. When we talk about social stratification, most people have in mind social class. But stratification literally just means how people are sorted into hierarchies of social status. We get the word stratification from the root word stratum. A stratum means a layer. So if you picture a layer cake, or if you're into geology, you could picture a cliff face with different layers of rock. What it means is that things are sorted into layers. So when we think of social stratification, we're talking about the ways in which people are sorted into layers or levels in society. The most common measure that sociologists use for thinking of social stratification is a term called socioeconomic status, which is often abbreviated SES for socioeconomic status. And all socioeconomic status is an index of social stratification. When we talk about an index, we generally mean a combination of measures used as an indicator. So the three indicators that are combined, or the three measures that are combined to create the index of socioeconomic status are income, education, and occupational prestige. So what I mean here is that income, education, and occupational prestige of a person are all considered in determining that person's socioeconomic status. Now, income is pretty straightforward. Income is the money earned from working or the money that comes into a person regularly through work or through investments or through some kind of annuity. It's how much money you get. Education, we generally mean formal educational attainment. Of course, there are lots of ways to learn, there are lots of ways to be educated, there are lots of kinds of knowledge, including lived experience. But when we talk about education in terms of socioeconomic status, we most often mean formal educational attainment. That just means how far did you go in school? And we generally think of that in terms of levels. So we generally think of that as education level, not the exact amount of education someone has. So we generally sort people based on education into several categories, such as less than high school diploma, or equivalent, some college but no college degree, some graduate education but no graduate degree, or graduate degree. So there are several levels of educational attainment that we consider. The final measure is a little squishier. It's a little more complex, and it's occupational prestige. If you notice, that term is hyperlinked, which means if you click on it, it'll take you to an article written in 2008 about the most recent occupational prestige scale that we've created. But occupational prestige is exactly what it sounds like. It's the social prestige or social honor that we attribute to different jobs. So it's not how much you make from what you do for a living. That's covered in income. And it's not how demanding your job is, because that's covered under education. It's literally how prestigious do most Americans think your job is. And we determine this in the same way sociologists determine many things, through survey research. So if you read this article, you'll see that what the researchers have done in creating this scale of occupational prestige is literally ask thousands of Americans to rank hundreds of occupations in order from least prestigious to most prestigious. And then they've given each occupation a score from 1 to 10. The highest score appears to be surgeon at 7.7, and the lowest score appears to be street corner drug dealer at 1.9. So you can see that occupational prestige is just how honorable or how worthy do most Americans think what you do for a living is. So we combine all of these measures, income, education, and occupational prestige, into an index that we call socioeconomic status. And this idea of socioeconomic status is what we're going to be talking about when we talk about class for the rest of this lecture. A concept we don't generally consider in measuring someone's socioeconomic status, but that we could consider, is wealth. We generally consider income, which is the money that comes in every so often. What we don't generally consider is wealth, which is someone's total assets minus their debt. So this can be thought of as everything a person owns. Some differences between income and wealth. Wealth, unlike income, is transferable, meaning if you own something, you can give it to someone else. Wealth is inheritable, meaning that if a person dies, they can leave wealth that they own to somebody else. And wealth, unlike income, is not dependent on work. Since wealth is what someone owns, not what something earns, if I own, say, $100,000 in wealth and I stop working, I will still own that wealth as long as I don't accrue additional debt. So when we talk about income, we're not talking about wealth. Wealth is a separate concept, but we can also think of social class as being affected by wealth. So for example, we could think of someone who had a high income but not very much wealth, perhaps because they owed a lot of money in debt. And we can also think of someone who had a lot of wealth but virtually no income, such as someone who inherited a lot of money and thus owns wealth and doesn't necessarily earn anything at all. So it's important to understand when we talk about income that we're not accounting for wealth. And it's also important to understand that when we talk about class, this index of socioeconomic status doesn't give us the full picture because it doesn't account for how much wealth someone owns. So this chart uses data from 2014, and it represents the wealth breakdown of the United States. So this area in blue represents the 1% of wealthiest Americans. And you can see that they own about 29% of all U.S. wealth. So that's 1% of the population, 29% of the wealth. And then this area in red represents the rest of the top 20% of earners. So the top 19% minus this 1%. And you can see that 19% of the population represented in red owns 48% of U.S. wealth. This green area represents the middle 60% of American wealth owners. So the area in green represents the wealth owned by 60% of Americans, and 60% of Americans in the middle own 21% of U.S. wealth. And then in purple, we see the bottom 20%, the 20% of Americans who are the least wealthy own just 2% of U.S. wealth. So this is the wealth breakdown of the United States. The top 20% combined own 72% of U.S. wealth. The middle 60% own 21%, and the bottom 20% own 2%. So unlike wealth, income is money made by working, or occasionally as income from investments. So income, unlike wealth, it's not transferable. So if I earn, say, $50,000 a year working, I can't transfer that income to somebody else. If I quit working, the money stops coming in. I can't transfer my income to another person. It's not inheritable. My children will not inherit my income when I die. Once I quit earning it, it quits coming in. And as I've already kind of explained, income is generally dependent on work. So I earn money based on the work that I do. If I stop doing my job, I stop getting paid for my job. So this chart shows average after-tax income in the United States from 1979 to 2010. So just to orient you to the chart, on the left-hand side, we see the y-axis. This is dollars of income after taxes per U.S. household. So we see that it goes from 0 at the bottom to $2,500,000 at the top in increments of $500,000. Then the horizontal x-axis on the bottom of the chart goes from the year 1979 to the year 2009. So this is about 10 years old, but it's still a pretty accurate representation. This is just the best breakdown of the data I could find to illustrate. So then the colored lines in the body of the chart represent different groups of earners. So the kind of salmon pink line at the top represents the top 1% of all earners. The kind of grayish blue line, second from the top, represents the top 5% of earners. Then that orange line in the middle represents all American earners. So this is overall income of all Americans after taxes. The kind of turquoise teal line underneath the orange line represents the top 20% of earners. And from there, all the lines are kind of clumped together, but try to stick with me. The purple line represents the 20% of earners who are second from the top. So the second richest fifth of Americans. The green line underneath that represents the third richest 20% of Americans. The red line under that represents the second poorest 20% of Americans. And then the line all the way at the bottom represents, that you can barely see because it's pressed up against the legend, represents the bottom earners, the poorest 20% of all Americans. So if you notice, since 1979, the top 1% of earners, this is where we really see a lot of movement. The top 1% of earners have gone from earning about $750,000 a year in 1979 after taxes to peaking out just above $2 million a year after taxes in 2008, and then dropping with the 2008 recession and rebounding just a little to just over $1.5 million in 2009. The next the top 5% of earners, so this includes this top 1% plus the next 4% down, have gone from earning just about $500,000 in 1979 to earning just about $750,000 a year after taxes in 2009. And you see they too had a peak right around 2007, and then dropped with the recession, but not very much. They weren't earning as much, and the recession didn't impact them as severely. Then if you look at the rest of the nation, basically, you can see a little movement in this top 20%, who went from about $250,000 a year after taxes to almost $500,000 a year after taxes. with just a tiny peak and dip related to the 2008 recession. But then you notice that the next, the fourth, third, second, and bottom 20%, so that's 80% of Americans, have had essentially flat income. Now, this is inflation adjusted, of course. So all of these dollars are represented in 2014 dollars. So you notice that from 1979 to 2009, there's been essentially no change. And in 2014 dollars, the bottom 80% of Americans are still earning right around $100,000 a year. The actual median income in 2019 for a household was $63,000 a year. So that means that if you take all Americans and line them up in a row, and you look at the one who falls in the middle, that person earns about $63,000 a year as of 2019. So now that we've talked about how Americans are stratified by income and wealth, it might be useful to think about how social mobility works. That is, how is someone's income or wealth determined? An important concept related to this idea is life chances. The idea of life chances comes to us from the theorist Max Weber, that's Weber, Weber, who said that the wealthy basically have access to opportunities for their children, and that parental wealth essentially purchases access to opportunities. So some of these opportunities are less obvious to us. Some opportunities are pretty obvious. For example, if your parents have a high power occupation, they can help you network. If your parents have a lot of money, they can send you to really good schools. But some opportunities we don't think about include things like early childhood environment. If your parents have more money, they can afford to provide you with a better, safer, happier, and calmer environment early in your childhood, which can set you up to learn and grow better. So we can also think about educational enrichment. If you are the child of parents who have to work all the time to just make ends meet, they may send you to school and they may do their best to help with your education, but they're probably not able, in terms of time or money, to help you get a lot more educational opportunities than you're provided at school. So, for example, wealthy parents might send their kids to summer camps that do educational enrichment. They might provide access to their children, to after school hobbies or after school clubs that help them to learn and grow and develop. They might also do things on weekends like take them to museums, take them to see symphony performances, take them to special classes, or help them engage in hobbies like martial arts or art or sports. Whereas parents who have to work more and have trouble affording things might only be able to give their children the educational opportunities provided by the school system and not much else. They may have to spend free time doing things like teaching their children to help with chores, or teaching their children to stay safe, or teaching their children to entertain themselves so that parents can work. This relates to another opportunity we don't typically think of, which is protection from risk. If your parents have more resources, they're generally able to protect you from certain risks. For example, they may be able to let you live in a safer neighborhood. They may be able to protect you from illness by providing you good preventative medical care. They may be able to protect you from getting into trouble because they're able to supervise you more effectively. They may also be able to protect you from legal trouble by being able to spend more time with you and keep you from doing things that would tend to get you into trouble, but also by being able to, for example, hire attorneys if you get into trouble. So protection from risk that would tend to limit opportunity. But the most kind of prevalent concept we think about when we think about life chances is this idea we call social capital. Now, capital, in terms of business, are the resources that a person invests in order to earn more money. So when we think of social capital, we're thinking of social resources that a person can invest or leverage in order to gain more opportunity. So social capital are those kind of soft, squishy resources that our parents have that they're able to give us access to, such as a valuable social network. How a lot of wealthier people's children end up getting their first job is through a connection through their parents or an uncle or aunt or a family friend. So rich social networks are one example of social capital. Other examples of social capital might include social skills. Being taught to negotiate by your parents or being taught to have professional manners is something that parents who are wealthier can generally teach their children that parents who have to work all the time or who work at lower earning occupations may not have access to that kind of knowledge or those kinds of skills. So social capital includes soft skills like professionalism. It includes social networks. It can also include things like tastes and habits, which we'll talk more about when we talk about postmodernist theory. But keep in mind this idea of social capital, the social skills and social opportunities that our parents provide for us that we can then leverage into more opportunity for ourselves. So when we think about life chances, we often think primarily about education, specifically about having access to a college education. So this chart, which comes from Chetty and colleagues at the Brookings Institute with data from 2016, shows us the connection or the correlation between parents' income and attending college ages 18 to 21. So we can see here that this is essentially a straight line, which means a strong positive correlation. That means that parent income is a strong predictor of attending college. So what we see is that parents who earn at the median, about 60% of their children are in college ages 18 to 21. Those whose income are at the very bottom, only about 20% of their children are in college ages 18 to 21. And for those who earn at the very top of the income distribution, 93 to 95% of their children are in college at ages 18 to 21, with a straight line going all the way from about 23, 25%, all the way up to about 93 or 95%, with very little, wiggling in the middle. So this tells us that your parents' income is incredibly strongly correlated with whether or not you will attend college at kind of what we consider traditional college age. Now, of course, this doesn't include people who later, through their own work, go to college on their own at an older than traditional age. And that's important to consider. This doesn't mean that the people who are not going to college at the bottom of the distribution, who are not going to college ages 18 to 21, won't go to college eventually. But we can't deny that having a college education at 22 is beneficial in terms of earning trajectories. So this chart shows us something a little more complex. This chart shows us how likely men and women are to be employed when they're 30 years old, correlated with parents' incomes. So we see that women are slightly less likely to be employed than men at most income levels, but for those whose incomes are the lowest, women are actually more likely to be employed than men. And we can talk more about that when we get into gender later on in the semester. But what we see is that for boys whose parents earn at the very bottom to the bottom 20% of incomes, only about 60 to 75% are employed by age 30, compared with those whose parents earn at 100%. We see that about 80% of them are employed at age 30. Now, notice that it drops off at right around the 90th percentile of earners. This could be because people above the 90th percentile are considered independently wealthy and may not need to work. Or it could include people who are pursuing higher education, for example, doctoral degrees. But we see that, especially for men, having parents who earn very low incomes is associated with being less likely to work at age 30. Now, we can consider many reasons for this. And one reason might be that they're expected to do more for their family, that they're expected to help out with the family more. But more likely explanations are lack of access to education, lack of access to good social networks that would tend to lead to jobs, but also lack of an environment where jobs are to be found. So in the next slide, we're going to talk about geography. Or in a few slides, we're going to talk about geography and the fact that where you live relates to how much money your parents make and also relates to how able you are to find a job. So implicit in the idea of life chances is the idea of social mobility. By social mobility, we generally mean upward mobility, which is the ability to exceed the social class you are born in. Many people colloquially call this idea the American dream, the idea that children can do better than their parents economically. And for a lot of American history, this was the norm. For most of American history, children have economically exceeded the class they were born in when they grew up. But since the 1940s, this has been changing. Since the 1940s, we haven't seen as much upward social mobility as we used to in this country. And there are several reasons for this. The two most important drivers of these trends appear to be innovation and automation, meaning that a lot of the high-paying jobs that people used to count on to provide upward social mobility have been innovated or automated away. What that means is when corporations make a lot of profits, the most efficient thing for them to invest in is making processes more efficient. So instead of spending the money that they earn or the profit that they earn to pay more workers, it's much more efficient for corporations or for companies to invest in making processes more efficient, including automating certain jobs. So a lot of the kind of mid-wage jobs that people used to aspire to having, such as factory worker, automotive worker, bus driver, train engineer, things like that, have been innovated or automated out. We also see a lot of increasing inequality in post-secondary education. So the good news is that more Americans are graduating from high school and college than ever. The bad news is that it's really unequal who's graduating from college. And as college graduation rates increase, college is becoming the new high school. That is, a college degree is becoming kind of the minimum credential that employers expect a worker to have. It used to be that if you had, and not too long ago, even when I was in college, that you were told if you get a college degree, you'll earn a good living, you'll get a good job. But we know now that that's not really the case. Unemployment and underemployment are increasingly high among college graduates. But also, as we saw in the previous chart, um, whether you go to college or not largely depends on how much money your parents have. So we're seeing increasing inequality in post secondary education. However, what we're not seeing is a change in how people feel about this ideal of social mobility. People still embrace this ideal of social mobility despite the fact that it's becoming less available. That is, most parents still say that they work hard so that their children can do better than they did. And most young adults still say that they expect to do better than their parents did economically. This chart illustrates the idea of decreasing social mobility. So, to orient you to the chart, the y-axis going up and down on the left side of the chart represents the percentage of children who are earning more than their parents did. And the y-axis going across the bottom of the chart represents the birth cohort of those children. So children born in 1940 at the left, and children born in 1984 at the right. So just for reference, I was born in 1987. My older brother was born in 1980. So we're talking about people who are in their 30s and early 40s today, versus people born in 1940. We're talking about people somewhere in between my grandparents' age and my parents' age. So people who would be in their 70s today. So for people born in 1940, 90% of them, when they were adults, ended up out earning their parents, and that peaked in 1940. By 1960, we were seeing a real drop in the number of children. By the time we were looking at children born in the 1960s, so people who would be in their 50s today, we see that just under 60% were earning more than their parents. We see a little rebound effect in children born in the 70s, but then by the time we get to children born in the late 70s to 80s, we see that just over 50% of children are earning more than their parents earned. So that means for my generation, just over 50% of my generation is earning more than my parents' generation earned. This graphic shows something a little different. This graphic shows for children whose parents earned at the 25th percentile, meaning they were in the 25% of poorest Americans, the bottom quarter of American earners. For children whose parents earned at the 25th percentile, what is the mean percentile of their earnings? That is, what is the average percentile of earnings for children whose parents earned at the 25th percentile? And I want you to notice that it varies greatly by geography. The darker the color on this chart, the less mobility we can expect. So notice on the legend that the darkest red color at the bottom of the legend represents children who earn at the 26th to 37th percentile, meaning they've barely moved from where their parents were. And the lightest color up at the top, that kind of very pale yellowish white, represents children earning at the 52nd to 65th percentile, meaning they're in the top half of earners. So notice that in the deep South, including Alabama, we see very little social mobility. The same for pockets in the Southwest, and a little better for pockets in the Northwest and Northeast. The middle of the country appears to be where the most social and economic mobility is. Notice that Alaska has little mobility and Hawaii has little mobility. So we can look at how industry is distributed, but also what the wealth of an area is. The areas that have the least economic mobility are some of the poorest areas of the country. So, what this tells us is that when a region's economy is worse, social mobility within that region is worse. Let's talk about some theoretical perspectives on social inequality, specifically class inequality or social stratification. So, the most straightforward theory related to social inequality is conflict theory. According to conflict theory, the bourgeoisie, or the capitalist class, control the means of production. The means of production here just mean anything used for making money. So it could be a factory, a farm, a ship, an industry of any kind. The proletariat, or working class, sells their labor for wages. So these are people who don't own the store, don't own the factory, don't own the ship, don't own the equipment, and just go to work for pay. That's pretty much everybody. So, according to Marx, where we get the conflict theory, the capitalist system depends on poverty and unemployment to some extent. Another way to put this is under a capitalist society, according to Marx, it's actually beneficial for the bourgeoisie if there's some degree of poverty and unemployment because it motivates workers to work harder and for less wages to avoid poverty, and the unemployed provide a pool of surplus labor. They're potential workers who can be had for very little money. So capitalist systems, according to Marx, will thrive with some level of poverty and unemployment. For Marx, class is reproduced through inheritance, specifically inheritance of goods or of means of production. So if I own farmland, or I own a factory, or I own a lot of capital, meaning money, from having owned the means of production, I then pass that on to my children, who then inherit my class status because they inherit the means of production. It's important to note that Marx thinks that the class system will eventually be destroyed when the proletariat form what he calls class consciousness. For Marx, class consciousness is simply an awareness that the working class is oppressed. To form class consciousness just means that the working class will realize that their labor is being exploited for the profit of the bourgeoisie, and that they will then rise up in a rebellion and seize the means of production. So workers will take over the shop. Workers will take over the factories, will run the store, will run the farm. And we can already see this in the form of what we call co-ops, where businesses or credit unions or farms or industries are worker-owned. Marx says this will happen in a revolutionary way, but there are other alternatives. It could happen in a low conflict way where workers simply gradually take over an industry. So, another perspective on class inequality is a structural functionalist perspective. So, we tend to associate the structural functionalist perspective with Durkheim, who gave us the definition of class as being about control of means and goods. So Durkheim says that class is defined as not just owning or controlling the means of production, but also controlling wealth and material possessions. So other later theorists, followers of Durkheim, who are structural functionalists, argue that social stratification or inequality is actually functional for society. He claims that these theorists claim that when some work is rewarded much more than other kinds of work, that it provides incentive to work hard and to do important jobs. These theorists, I'm thinking specifically of two theorists named Davis and Moore, argue that Um, Inequality ensures that people are willing to do unpleasant work. They essentially say that if we had no poor people, no people who were hard up for work, who would work as garbage collectors or street sweepers or dog catchers or any other unpleasant task? Um, for structural functionalists, class is reproduced through two mechanisms, through inheritance of goods and means. So, just as Marx said, passing down what we own to our children, as well as through learning. So, for functionalists, social learning plays a role in class. It's not just about what you own, it's also about the soft skills, the social capital that our parents give us. Max Weber actually gave us a much more complex account of how class functions in society. So, for Max Weber, who was a student of Marx, so Max Weber had read Marx and understood Marx's theory that eventually the working class would rise up and seize the means of production and overthrow the bourgeoisie. Weber did not think this would happen. Weber agreed that inequality existed, but he didn't think that the class structure would change. Instead, he thinks it will be reproduced forever. So Weber says this is true because people don't act based on their class, because class is not something people identify with. If you remember, very early in this lecture, we said that class was a category, not a social group. It's a social category. And a category is a demographic grouping. So another example of a demographic grouping would be men 18 to 25. Now, if you're a man who's 18 to 25, you may be aware that you're a man aged 18 to 25, but you don't necessarily identify with that. You don't necessarily have any interests as a man aged 18 to 25. What I mean is, you couldn't identify all other men who are aged 18 to 25 in the world. That would be too many people who have too many other things separating them. It's not as if you have men aged 18 to 25 committee meetings every week either. You don't necessarily identify with this grouping because it's a category. An example of a group would be like a sports team or a church congregation. It's a social grouping where you understand that you're a member of this group, you identify with the group, you recognize other members of the group, and you share interests or goals with other members of that group. So Weber argues that class is not a group, that we can't form consciousness or motivation around our class status because class is not a group. Class is merely a category for Weber. He doesn't use this word, but this is what he's describing. He describes class as something that can be used to group people, but that is merely categorical. So he says that people don't act based on their class interests because class isn't something we identify with. It's not something we think about. He says instead, people will act based on their status and their party. He defines a person's status as their level of social prestige. Remember earlier in the first couple of slides when we talked about occupational prestige? This is very similar to what Weber has in mind when he talks about social honor or social prestige. He means how much you're esteemed by society. So here you can think of everyone from celebrities to old money families who are seen as very important, like the Kennedys or the Vanderbilts. People who are prestigious, people who are seen as classy. And for Weber, people will act in accordance to with their status. They will act according to how much social prestige and honor they have, and they will act in such a way that consolidates their social power. So how they might do this is by creating spaces where only people of a certain status can get in. Exclusive clubs, for example, or parties that only certain kinds of people are invited to, or boards that only certain kinds of people are invited to sit on. So this is what Weber means by status. And he says that people of a certain status will act in such a way to consolidate social power, basically to keep other people from breaking into their social networks and their social circles so that they can monopolize opportunity for themselves and for people like them and for their children. He also says that people will act based on party. We can think of party as any political interest group. So I like to give the example of animal rights activists. I used to, and to some extent still do, belong to groups associated with animal rights. While this is not something that we would consider a political party like Democrats, Republicans, Libertarians, or Green Party, it is a political interest group. That is, it's something I can identify with. I'm an animal rights activist person. It's something I might hold meetings or discussions around, my dedication to animal rights. It's also something that I can identify other people based on. I can identify other people as people like me based on our dedication to animal rights. And for Weber, this party, this group of animal rights activists, is going to try to work in ways that will consolidate political power. So if I belong to an animal rights based interest group, I might try to lobby Congress members or try to lobby lawmakers to get them to make laws that are in my political interest. And once I've done that and gained some political power, I might act in ways that would tend to consolidate that power. I might, for example, donate to a political action committee to try to get a particular candidate elected. Or I might lobby for certain pieces of legislation that would give my party more power. So Weber says essentially that people are so concerned with acting based on their status and based on their party that they're not going to act in accordance with class. Basically, I can't be bothered with class because I'm too busy thinking about status and party. Counterintuitively, this is exactly how Weber says that class is reproduced. Weber says that the structure we have, the system of class that we have, is reproduced because those in power, based on their status and their party, monopolize power and opportunity. So the people who control state power or political power based on party, and who control social power based on status, are going to try to monopolize opportunities for people like them. And while these people are not acting based on their class status, we may have intuited already that people who have a lot of political power and people who have a lot of social prestige also tend to have a lot of money. So for Weber, this is how class is reproduced. Now, this is a very complex argument that Weber has made, much more complex than a structural functionalist argument or a conflict argument. So you may have questions about this. This would be a great topic to discuss on the discussion forums on Moodle, and I can contribute to those discussions. Please email me about this in particular if you have any questions. Symbolic interaction offers us a different kind of perspective on class stratification because symbolic interactionism is a micro theory and class is a large-scale social structure. So symbolic interaction talks about how class is part of identity. So This is what we mean when we say a person is acting classy or a person has class. What we mean is that a person may identify with a class identity. Most Americans, interestingly, say that they're middle class. Now, if you look at the charts we saw earlier in this presentation, you'll notice that 60% of Americans own about 20% of the wealth, meaning most Americans are absolutely not middle class. 60% of Americans own less than a fifth of the wealth. So it makes no sense to say that most Americans are middle class. Most Americans are solidly working class. However, we think of ourselves as having middle class values and being middle class people. So for symbolic interactionists, class is part of identity, and class is socially transmitted. What that means is that we learn what our class identity is in the same way that we learn what our religious identity is or what our political identity is. We learn it through social interactions with significant others. So, I might have learned about my class status through conversations with my parents, through conversations with my brothers, but also through conversations with friends who might have had the same class status or different class status from me. I'll give you an example of this. I was homeschooled until I was in the 10th grade. And when I was in the 10th grade, I started going to public school. My favorite shoes at that time were a pair of Birkenstock sandals that I wore to school every day. And one day, a classmate called me out and said, "Are you wearing real Birkenstocks?" And I said, "Well, they're real. I don't know what you mean, real Birkenstocks, though." And he said, "Are those real Birkenstocks?" And I said, "As opposed to what?" And he said, "As opposed to knockoff Birkenstocks." And I said, "I didn't know those existed." And he started teasing me, saying that I was rich. Well, I had never thought of myself as a rich person, but I realized that day that I was able to afford certain things that other people really weren't. And that I was enacting that in the way I dressed. And that really tripped me out. I wasn't prepared to think about myself that way. But I learned about my class identity through an interaction with a significant other who stood in contrast to my identity. So, in a way, that was a social transmission of class. For symbolic interactionists, people behave based upon class status. So, people behave in a way that they think is consistent with how they identify their class. So if I think of myself as a working class person, I may choose to drive a pickup truck. I may choose to wear certain kinds of clothing. Maybe I want to wear Wrangler jeans. Maybe I want to wear, t-shirts with a pocket on them. Maybe I want to act in accordance with what I think working class people are like. If I see myself as someone who's upper class, maybe I want to behave in ways that I think represent upper class status. And similarly, for symbolic interactionists, we know what class a person has because of their behavior. So just like we enact, if you go back to dramaturgy theory, just like we enact other parts of our identity in terms of our presentation of self, class identity is part of our presentation of self. When we present ourselves, we're presenting ourselves in a way that's consistent with what we perceive our class status to be. The final theoretical perspective I want us to talk about on this topic is the postmodern perspective. Now, postmodern has become kind of a byword. It's used a lot to just mean something that is new agey or ultra modern or whatever. It's used in a dismissive way a lot, but it's actually a body of theoretical work which seeks to describe how society is in a post-industrial age. So if you we think of the term modern as just meaning the way things are right now. But in sociology, the idea of modernity or modernness describes a particular period in history, specifically the industrial period, the period characterized by wide scale manufacturing. Um, so you can think of really the modern period as ending in the 60s, 70s, and maybe even as late as the 80s. The modern period for sociologists is over. Weber was the first theorist to really describe modernity as a part of history, to really describe the modern era as a moment in history. And so when we describe something as postmodern, we really mean post industrial, post World War II, post Vietnam War, um, post that moment in history. So, unlike a lot of the theories we've talked about, postmodernism doesn't really say whether class stratification is good or bad. It really just seeks to explain how class is done in postmodern society. So, for postmodernists, class is transmitted based on lifestyle. For postmodernists, lifestyle means something very particular. Lifestyle is a combination of our manners, our mannerisms, our habits, and our habitus. Where manners are the ways in which we act and interact with others, our mannerisms are our ways of behaving unconsciously. So, how we speak, how we gesture, how we behave ourselves. Our habits are the things we routinely do, and our habitus is how we routinely portray ourselves. So, I might have a habit, for example, of pacing when I lecture. That's a habit. Habitus is maybe how I like to dress, or how I like to style my hair, or whether or not I put on makeup. Um, so habit and habitus are related, but they're different ideas. Um, and so for postmodernists, class is transmitted by transmitting lifestyle. Um, Lifestyle includes everything I like to do, everything, the way I like to live, my manner of living. So perhaps my lifestyle includes taking 2 vacations every year. Perhaps my lifestyle includes having a house and a lake house. Perhaps my lifestyle includes eating cheese and grapes for lunch every day. Um, these are elements that are very classed, right? They're behaviors that have class associations with them. Um, and so for postmodernists, it's not important what my class actually is. It's not important how much money I actually make or what I actually do for a living. What's important is the lifestyle that I live. And how I transmit class to my children is through teaching them my lifestyle, through teaching them to behave in certain ways, to have certain habits, to have certain manners, to enjoy certain things. And this brings me to my next point, that class is based upon ideology rather than fact. So postmodernists say that it really makes very little sense to say that class is based on income or occupation because, of course, it's impossible to know what someone else's income is, or what someone else's wealth is, or even really how much money someone gets paid for a certain occupation. These things for postmodernists don't matter. What's important is what we believe about our class status, what we believe class means. So instead of thinking of class, for postmodernists, you might do better to think of classiness. That we're not stratified based on how much money we have, or how much wealth we own, or how much occupational prestige we have. We're stratified based on how classy we appear. and how classy we believe we are. So we may believe or behave in a way that's associated with a class status that modernists would say we hadn't attained. So, for example, let's say that I had $10 million. I don't, but let's just say that I had $10 million. But that I decided I wanted to live a working class lifestyle. Could I achieve that? Yes, I could. All I would have to do is live in a much smaller home than I could afford, in a certain kind of neighborhood. I would need to wear cheaper clothes than I could afford. I would probably drive a different kind of car, maybe an older model car, maybe one that was pre owned. And I would probably listen to different kinds of music. And I would probably eat different kinds of food. And I would probably do things that I associated with a working class lifestyle rather than living in accordance with how much money I had. Now, most people don't do this, but the mere fact that it's possible tells us, postmodernists would say, tells us that class is more an idea than a fact. Of course, it's much more common to see people doing the opposite, right? To see people trying to borrow money to act as if they belong to a class they don't belong to, a higher class than they belong to. But that too is based upon ideas of what class means rather than the actual fact of having achieved a certain status. So for postmodernists, class is reproduced primarily through manners and mannerisms. Primarily, class is reproduced by teaching our children to have the same kind of ideologies and the same kind of lifestyles that we have, according to our class status. This is a very kind of complex theory to teach in an intro class, but I feel it's important for you to understand. So again, this would be a good one to discuss in the forums on Moodle. It would also be a good one to email me about if you have any questions.